Thank you very much for your patience and for joining us today. We'll get started with our webinar. For that, I'm going to turn it over to the CEO of the World Trade Center of Northern California, Kevin Mather.
Thank you, Kimberly. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us and to learn a little bit about the importing process. We are the World Trade Center Northern California, and really our focus is just what that first slide said. We try to make trade easier for businesses of all size. First of all, a couple of just pieces of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. Just wanted to give you a heads up on that. We will post a link to the video afterwards so that you can go back and watch it again and rewatch any sections that you'd like to. The other thing is that we will take and have questions at the end of the webinar. You can take and type them into the Q&A during the session, but just recognize that we'll handle all of those at the end. And then I also want to thank the Northern California Small Business Development Centers. They are our funding partners that allow us to do this work and to bring these opportunities and this education and these fabulous speakers to businesses throughout Northern California. So we are the part of the World Trade Center Association. There are 333 World Trade Centers all around the planet. And we are located here in Sacramento, but we serve the northern 36 counties of Northern California. We are an SBDC affiliate, and what we do is that we are really a technical assistance provider and expert. We have a very deep bench of subject matter experts in the area of international trade, whether that's importing, like you're going to hear today, exporting, online cross-border e-commerce, and also in domestic e-commerce. And so we have a very deep bench, like I say, of subject matter experts, and you'll hear from some of them today. And then what we really do is we really focus on helping businesses to be successful by providing high-quality education. Today's an example of that. We provide accesses to resources. We connect people to the trade ecosystem. If you need, a good logistics partner, if you need a customs broker, if you need to meet with the U.S. Commercial Service, if you need international financing, we can connect you in to all of those. And then we also have a worldwide network of partners through the World Trade Center Association. And with that, I'll thank all of our panelists and attendees today, and I'll turn it back over to Kimberly.
Thank you, Kevin. And I am happy to introduce to you all today our three panelists. First, Sylvia Martini. Sylvia is an SBDC counselor supporting clients with international trade, marketing and sales, public relations, and web communications. Bilingual in German and English, she has over 30 years of experience in international marketing and sales in several diverse industries, where she's conducted competitive analysis, identified markets for startups, developed marketing strategies, trade shows, and events. Sylvia has an international business certificate and is a certified global business professional with NASBITE International. Next, Dan Swartz. Dan leads the customs and trade practice for Crow LLP and has 25 years of trade advisory, customs brokerage, and global logistics experience. He has served in senior leadership roles, including the qualifying license holder and vice president for a Fortune 250 global freight forwarding company. Dan has extensive experience helping companies navigate the complexity of export laws and regulations. He also earned his custom brokerage license in 1998 and his IATA-FIATA diploma in 2000, and is a certified import and export specialist with the National Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarders Association of America. Last but certainly not least, Dan Pendergrass is an SBDC counselor and a professional logistician with over 30 years of experience in the freight forwarding industry. He's held various management, training, sales, and international and domestic operational positions with large global corporations and local companies. Dan is adept at finding operational efficiencies and reducing costs in client supply chains. With that, I am going to turn it over to Sylvia, who will lead the panel conversation.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin, for the introduction, and Kimberly for your wonderful introduction. I will be surrounded by two Dans today. So these are my sparring partners. I will moderate this meeting and this webinar today. And these are the topics we would like to cover, but we will do this a little bit more in a conversational form. So we can ask questions here. I will ask questions, and then Dan and Dan will help me to provide some information. What we usually have when clients come to us, they have many questions. For instance, the topics we want to cover are Incoterms. You can also learn terms of sales, or the long form is international commercial terms. We will talk about how do you select a good partner? What is the role of freight forwarders and custom brokers? Why tariff classification? What does mean duty rates? Country of origin, free trade agreements. The United States had several free trade agreements. What kind of restrictions, licenses, and permits you need, and some other things about government requirements and product testing. So these are the most of the topics we would like to cover today. Let me just show you what are the questions or the fears people have and what we actually want. So the World Trade Center of Northern California can help you to find out how can you remove the fear associated with the unknowns. How can we provide education for you? You learn also the basic elements. Today is a webinar, especially for people they start with importing, but also for some importers or small businesses, they want a little bit more information behind and expand their markets. And then also we want to illustrate what you need to know and how we can help you. So let's start with an example. And everything starts with an idea. We put some information here on, and this will be more basic for a discussion. So there are many clients that come to us, often from other countries. Like me, I'm original from Germany, and sometimes I miss some products or services. So I'm looking for where can I buy it? Or maybe I just start my own business. So there was one wonderful lady. She is original from Pakistan, and she was interested in importing several foods she was missing here, and she couldn't find it in the United States. So she came to the idea, how can I bring in these products to the United States, and I can sell it to other people. They might have a need or demand for this product. So she came to our center and with several questions, and we helped her to find or to maybe bring the idea, the pre-venture, to a real small business. So my question for Dan and Dan today, what advice would you give her how to start? Dan Swartz, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, food's complicated, partly because you have a whole other government agency involved, U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And one of the troubles that a lot of importers run into when they first start importing is not recognize the fact that there are 40 different federal government agencies that have some form of jurisdiction over the importation of goods into our country. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, they are the hub of the various spokes of the different government agencies. They are the ones who really control the flow of data, documents, and information that goes down to these other government agencies. And even Customs has some responsibility to help enforcing the laws of these other government agencies. But U.S. Food and Drug Administration, in this case, they would have direct responsibility over the importing a food product, particularly from a country like Pakistan. And so it's something you have to ferret out during your import process. You have to examine what are the other agencies that may have some sort of interest in my product. The fear that you run into potentially is that if you don't do your homework and you try to import these goods, you're going to have a lot of difficulty in trying to get them cleared through customs. In the meantime, your freight will sit at the port or at the airport, accumulating storage per diem every day until you get these issues resolved with the government agencies.
And the other thing you might want to do is just spend some time in looking for a supplier that's going to meet your needs. Finding a supplier in a foreign country can be difficult, but there are agencies that can help. Like Kevin referred to earlier, the WTC has offices all around the world that may be able to suggest or recommend a particular supplier. The other thing you can look for is an international freight forwarder that has offices in the city or the country that you're going to import from. They may have recommendations. The other thing is looking for a supplier that might be ISO certified or have some other quality certification, which shows they've gone under some sort of review to document their processes and ensure a quality outcome for that. And then also, I think with any relationship, talk to them ahead of time. Ask for a Zoom meeting. Ask for references. Ask for people that have done business with them so that you can talk with them to ensure that the product you're going to get is of the quality that you want.
So how can you, when you import some samples, many clients do this and they pay mostly for the samples, how can they go to the next step when it comes to product testing? Then you want to take this question?
Yeah, there's a number of different third-party companies out there. Underwriter Laboratories is one, for example, STS, Bureau Veritas. There's a number of third-party companies who, that's what they offer. That's what they do, is they go and they test product and issue certifications that can be used to present to customs authorities for import. Depending upon the nature of the goods, there may be specific criteria or requirements that you have to meet. So for example, if you're importing sunglasses into the United States, you may be surprised to know that they fall under the jurisdiction of the US Food and Drug Administration. And one of the things they require is what's called a drop ball test, where there's a test that they take the sunglass, they drop a metal ball from a certain height to see whether or not the glass breaks. And you have to be able to present a certification to customs that your product has gone through this test. Using these third parties, that's what they do, is they do this type of testing. Your foreign supplier as well, more likely than not, particularly if they're in China, they're going to have experience in dealing with these issues. So it's important to let them know what your plans are with the product, what countries you're looking to ship into, because more likely than not, they've gone through this process before with other clients and they can help guide you.
Any cost involves just an estimate how much when it starts to test a product?
Well, one of the good things is a lot of these suppliers end up having relationships with the third-party testing companies directly. And in one of the cases, you can work with the supplier and have them take care of the testing activity there at origin. And then you're simply paying it as an additional cost to the FOB value of the goods.
All right. And then do you want to add something, or should we move over to the country of origin and free trade agreements?
No, please, Dan, continue on.
Then Spots continue on. He is in the flow.
Well, for country of origin is very important, especially now where there's this high tariff environment that we're in. There's a very high tariff on Chinese goods coming into the United States, ranging from 7.5% to 25%. This is a punitive tariff that was imposed back in 2018 by the Trump administration. So getting the country of origin correct is really important. Usually it's not that big of an issue. The goods are typically made in one country, but if you have anything that's like a work in progress that might be going to more than one country for production, it's something that you need to scrutinize. Regarding free trade agreements, the United States is a party to 14 different free trade agreements with 21 different countries. And some of our largest free trade agreements are the US and Mexico Canada free trade agreement that replaced NAFTA a few years ago. And then of course we have the CAFTA, which is the Caribbean countries, Central and South America, including the Dominican Republic. These free trade agreements offer a big opportunity for you as importers to bring goods into the United States at a duty-free or a significantly reduced duty percentage. Yeah, but in order to take advantage of these free trade agreements, there are specific rules that you have to follow. So it's really important before you claim something under a free trade agreement that you consult with your customs broker, a consultant, or even a trade attorney to ensure that you're not improperly claiming duty-free treatment.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Can you
and just
tell us?
to follow up on what Dan was saying, the exact same product, even though it may seem initially cheaper from country A, when all is put together with the tariffs and such that are levied against it, it might actually be less expensive to purchase the same item from a supplier in a different country.
Can you tell us a little bit about restrictions, licenses, and permits?
Sure. Goods coming into the United States may have certain restrictions. They may require certain license or permits. It's really important before you take that next step of issuing a purchase order that you really sit down and do what we call a landed cost calculation, where you look at the product. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but you look at the rates of duty that apply to it. And also you look to see what sort of conditions are on the product for import into the United States. So for example, if you're importing anything that has shell material or feathers for that matter, they fall under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And there are certain licenses and permits that you have to obtain in advance of importing those goods. We had mentioned earlier about the FDA and some of the conditions that they have, but there's other agencies like U.S. Commerce Department, and they actually require a license to import steel into the United States. So it's really important before you just cut a purchase order or start sending a check to a foreign supplier that you consult with Small Business Development, World Trade Council, trade attorneys, consultants, what have you, or even customs brokers, to really ferret these issues out in advance.
Before we move forward, that we have here one little point, government reporting requirement. What does it mean?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, you have 40 different government agencies that are now involved in the importing process. So as I touched on, you want to make sure that you understand what different government agencies have involvement and what are their requirements for your particular product that you're looking to import.
All right. So we have here the chart Incoterms. So this is a very important part. I already mentioned the Incoterms with a set of 11 individual rules. And this is the Incoterms 2020, so they change every 10 years a little bit. So if you want to talk about why our Incoterms are so important and how does it work and what are the most used Incoterms in your business. Dan Swartz?
So
Or Dan?
Incoterms, or international commercial terms, have been established by the International Chamber of Commerce, and they're used throughout international trade. And it designates at what point will the risk transfer from the shipper to the buyer. So it's very important when you're negotiating with your supplier as to what the Incoterms are going to be. So they range all the way from what's called Ex Works, meaning that you as the buyer are taking total responsibility for the transportation and assuming all of the risk from your shipper or from your supplier's door or warehouse all the way to yours. And then as it moves down the chart, it will go to DDP, or destination or duties, delivery duties paid, excuse me, I can get that out, meaning that the shipper is assuming all of the cost and the risk of getting the goods to you. So depending upon the volume that you're moving, whether it's more cost effective to go air, or if you have the volume to go ocean, that will determine really what Incoterm you're going to use, because some are more made for ocean, some are more for air. And it really just depends on how you want to negotiate your sale with your supplier. But at least in my experience, in my time in international shipping, if you're going via ocean, it's usually going to be FOB, which is the port of export, meaning that the supplier is going to be responsible for getting your goods from their factory or their door to the port of export, whether that's via air or via ocean. And then at that point, the risk will shift from the seller to the buyer. The other thing is, if you're going to go going by air, then it's usually CPT or DDP or DDU. Sorry, I'm delivered at place. It's changed. It used to be delivered duties unpaid. Now it's delivered at place. So it really depends on, but it will depend on your negotiation with your seller and at what point do you want to assume the risk if anything is damaged or lost.
So in my example of the client from Pakistan, when she is happy with the samples she imported and she wants to start importing food from Pakistan, what would be the best approach for her for a conversation, she as a buyer to the seller, and what kind of decision she should make? Because we know the Incoterms shows us who is responsible for all these processes from the manufacturing to her warehouse. What would you advise her? How should she negotiate with the seller? Dan Swartz, do you want to say something to this?
Yeah, sure. So in addition to risk, Incoterms also addresses two other important aspects. And one is, who incurs the cost of transportation? Is this a cost that's going to be borne by the seller or by the buyer? And then the other issue it addresses is, when does the responsibility for arranging carriage, meaning the transportation of goods, when does that transfer from the seller to the buyer? In the example of your client, Sylvia, what a lot of companies that are new to importing will do is they'll typically start with what we call the D level Incoterms, so like delivery duty paid or DAP. And a reason why is this is essentially what we call like a door-to-door Incoterm. The goods just show up at your facility or your home. And the advantage of that is that you're not having to be the importer of record. You're not having to figure out what the tariff classification is. Really, all the responsibility is on the seller to get the goods delivered to your door. What ends up happening as importers start buying more and more volume, they start to realize, hey, I can control more of my supply chain and try to lower those costs, because when you do DAP or DDP, you're doing so at a premium. Not only are you incurring those costs for transportation and the value of the product, but you're often getting additional handling fees included as well from the foreign supplier. So as they increase the volume, they start now looking at C terms like your CIF, CPT, and then as companies get much larger and they have now their own volume-based ability to go out in the marketplace and purchase contracts with steamship lines, for example, or work with a deal with a freight forwarder to get better pricing. Now you start seeing a lot of these companies move into the F terms like FOB, for example. So there's usually kind of a progression a lot of these companies follow that's pretty similar. But for your client in particular, Sylvia, it'd probably be best to have that conversation with the supplier to see whether or not they feel comfortable doing DDP and maybe starting off there. And then as the volume increases, start making adjustments.
Thank you.
Exactly. To piggyback on what Dan was saying, depending upon the volume that you're going to import, sometimes going via air is actually the more cost-effective option. And there comes a tipping point in the volume when it's much more cost-effective to go via sea.
So now, how do I get it here? So we looked a little bit about the Incoterms because these are a very important part, but how often we get this question, or the question is, what is landed cost? How should I calculate when finally I have the products on the way, I have my first potential customers, how should I calculate the price? So this is a very important question we always hear from our clients, especially from clients. Their background is not finance. They are a little bit insecure. How should I calculate it? What is landed cost, and how can our client calculate landed cost? What will be involved? Who wants to answer this at first?
Well, I'll start. So
you.
landed cost incorporates every possible expense to do with your transaction. And such as on the slideshow, it's the cost of your product plus any crating or packaging, possibly any export costs that your supplier might incur from shipping it out of the country, the transportation, the insurance, any warehousing, the on carriage once it gets to the US, the cost of customs brokerage and any duties, taxes, anything that it's the comprehensive cost of moving your goods from your supplier in your designated country to your door. So, and this is where, talking to people up front and understanding what's involved in this is important, because a lot of times, people will go, oh, well, I can buy this product at this price and it'll be great. And I can sell it to this price without knowing the additional costs that are going to be involved with the transportation, the customs brokerage, any possible duties and taxes. So calculating your landed cost up front is very important before you come to what will I sell this for?
Yeah. There is one big point I see here is insurance. How many people have no idea there is a global trade insurance you can sign up. How can I explain how important this is to need an insurance? Dan Swartz, do you want to cover this topic?
Yeah, sure. A lot of importers are unaware of the fact that the contract of carriage that you have with your freight forwarder, even a small parcel shipment through a FedEx and UPS for that matter, there's limitations to liability tied to that contract. And I haven't delved a lot into that world. I've never been really big in the insurance side of it, but I believe they cap it at something like $500 per container. It's a really minimal amount. Yeah, you could have a multi-million-dollar machine packed in a 40-foot ocean container, and it falls off that ship somewhere out in the middle of the South Pacific. And if you think you're going to go back to the ocean carrier and get that money from them, it's not going to happen. They're going to show you the bill of lading and say, this is the contracted carriage. We're capped at $500. So what do you do as the importer then to protect yourself? Well, the other option is to go out and get insurance. And there are companies that just specialize in what we call cargo marine insurance, or cargo insurance for that matter, if you're using other modes of transport, who specialize in underwriting policies to cover your imported goods. Now, if you're just beginning on this journey of being an importer, it may not be feasible for you right now to do that. But you may also want to check with your small parcel providers like UPS, for example. A lot of them do offer like an insurance option that you can check on the airway bill that they'll provide some additional coverage. In doing so, you have to provide disclosure to them. What is it that you're shipping? What's the value? But you definitely want, depending on the value of the product that you're importing, what concerns you may have about shrinkage or loss during transport, you may want to take a look at what sort of coverage you have for these goods.
Yeah, exactly. Any much freight forwarder, small parcel carrier will offer insurance, depending upon the cost of the product. The other thing to look at is that there's a differentiation between declared value and insurance value. Declared value definitely has limits. Insurance value pretty much covers everything, but you can purchase that through the forwarder or the steamship line, if you're big enough to use that, for individual shipments.
Thank you, Dan. So another very important part is here, what are tariffs? What is HTS? And clients hear this and say, oh my God, we talk about Incoterms, we talk about this, what is this? I don't know. I thought it's so easy to import, people taught me. So how, when I have I'm not in a trade agreement with countries, so what can I expect? How can I find out where is my harmonized tariff schedule, my code, what is my tariff classification? How can I find out what my duty rates are? I mean, usually it's great to have partners on your side and not doing on your own. That's the reason. Come to us or talk with Dan or with myself. But just to let the clients know or inform them a little bit and explain what will be the checklist of importing, and we have a checklist provided, to learn a little bit about the tariff classification and the duty rates. Who wants to start then? Swats?
Sure. When you are the importer of record, you have a legal obligation to exercise reasonable care with respect to the declared tariff classification, the declared value, and the rates of duty. This is statutory, it's law. And the tariff classification is a 10-digit code, and it comes out of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, which is published by the U.S. International Trade Commission. And it's a catalog of every type of product you can think of that would be imported into the United States, ranging from live animals to household furniture and everything in between. And with each 10-digit tariff classification, there's an associated rate of duty. And some categories of goods have higher rates of duty than others. For example, 40% of all the revenue collected by U.S. Customs comes from the apparel, textile, and footwear industries. We have the highest rates of duty on those particular goods. Whereas for like electronics, computers, mice, keyboards, they're largely duty-free. But it's important that before, again, you even cut a purchase order, that you go through the exercise of looking at your product and determining what's the tariff classification and what are the applicable rates of duty, because it will greatly impact your landed cost. Classifying goods under the tariff is not easy. It can be a bit subjective. You do run into situations on occasion where there may be 2 or more plausible tariff classifications. So it's really recommended to get with a partner, preferably a customs broker, a trade attorney, or somebody else who has knowledge of the inner workings of the tariff schedules system. There's a set of rules that you have to follow when you classify. They're called the general rules of interpretation. They're kind of a hierarchical set of rules that you have to follow. You want to ensure that your customs broker, your accountant, your attorney, whoever's going to be helping you on that effort, is familiar with these rules and that they have experience classifying it. And one of the reasons why you want to ensure that they know what they're doing is that when you file a customs entry, it's live and it will stay live or open for nearly a year. 314 days is the liquidation cycle, giving the opportunity for customs to come back and look at your customs entry. And if they don't like the tariff classification that you're using, they can actually change it, and then you can get a rate advance, meaning a bill from customs saying that you may owe additional duties. Mm-hmm. So as the old saying goes, measure twice, cut once. Make sure that you're looking at this tariff classification issue very closely if you're going to be in a position where you're acting as the importer of record.
Thank you, Dan. So let's say we are already in this status that we will go to the shipment. What kind of documentation my client needs to know? What is involved in documentation requirements? Then Pendergrass?
Sure. So any commercial transportation that you're going to look into or purchase is it's going to involve your supplier giving you a commercial invoice, which is just pretty much they're the seller, you're the buyer, this is the product, you know, it has the HTS code and it has the value of the goods. You know, pretty much standard commercial invoice type of things. And then also you'll want a packing list as to what specifically is in the box, the crate, whatever it might be. And then a certificate of origin. And again, like Dan was talking about earlier, this is important because the tariff will change depending upon the certificate, the country of origin, the certificate of origin, who is producing it. So that is important. And then the bill of lading, which is the transportation document showing the shipper, you as the consignee is the term, if you are the one receiving the goods, and you know, who is the transportation provider, depending upon whether it's an ocean carrier, an air freight company, or such. So those are the documents that you want pretty much in any transaction that you're going to get from your supplier overseas.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. Also, those documents, as you receive them in from your customs broker or freight forwarder, hold on to them. You actually have a legal obligation to retain those records for a 5-year period from the date of entry. So just as you keep records of your taxes and other important business records, make sure you're keeping these important customs documents as well.
So we talked about the Incoterms, but I also would like to know when my client has to find a good partner, helps through this whole process from import, also for exporting. So can you kindly explain what a freight forwarder or a customs broker does?
So one of my favorite books is called Good to Great by Jim Collins. And in the book, he talks extensively about when you're looking for a partner, you're not looking for a what, you look for who. You want a partner that you can trust, that's going to be on the same page as you are, that's looking out for your best interests. So again, doing due diligence and just investigating, talking with people. I think if you're going to use a freight forwarder, and a freight forwarder is somebody that is actually licensed to move goods internationally, whether by air or by ocean. And you can belong to, the term is IATA for air, and then you become either a steamship line provider or an NVOCC, non-vessel operating common carrier, which means you're licensed by the Federal Maritime Commission to move goods via ocean. So looking into finding the right partner, look for people locally that have offices in the country that you are wanting you're wanting to import from, because that would be important. Find people that you're comfortable with. But again, just investigate, look into things. Don't just say, okay, here I'm going to Google a freight forwarder and here I'm going to try this person. Well, no, ask for a meeting. Ask for a Zoom meeting, ask to talk with them. And again, ask for references from other people that have used them. You know, if you'll get to a place where you have a comfort level of giving this person really the responsibility for your business, as long as it's in transit, they're holding your goods.
Thank you, Dan. I mean, there is for sure a list people can look on specific websites to find somebody, but they also can ask us. We can help them to recommend, not just pointing to one person, of course, but we can also help you with some people we have a good experience for many, many years. So before we finalize and open this up for questions and answers, what can we go wrong? That's the reason we need all the partners. So maybe then with your experience, with your company in the background, I'm pretty sure not every day is sunshine.
No, that's right, Sylvia. Yeah, there are things that can go wrong. And we don't want to scare you. We do want to encourage you to go out there and build these connections with foreign suppliers. You've come up, I'm sure, with great ideas for businesses. But the reality is to bring any business into fruition, you have to figure out the logistics side of it. And, that's really what the Small Business Development Council and the World Trade Council or Center, what they do to help support building businesses in our communities. So finding the right partners is really crucial in that effort, but also understanding that this is something that is regulated in our country and that there are government agencies, and you do have to be mindful of what the regulations are. So as Dan pointed out earlier, finding the right person who's going to help support and guide you through that process is crucial. In terms of the things that can go wrong, the goods, when they enter into the United States, they are under customs supervision. They're in bonded facilities. In order to get them out of that facility and get it to your building, you have to clear customs by filing documents known as a customs entry form. And the information that's on that form has to be accurate and correct. And we talked earlier about tariff classification and country of origin. Value is also a very important consideration as well. I mentioned earlier that under the law, you are legally obligated as the importer of record to ensure that you're exercising reasonable care with respect to the declared tariff classification, value, and rate of duty. So what is reasonable care? It's basically a way of saying, what would a reasonable person do in that particular situation? That's kind of standard that the government looks at. Now, if you violate the law, if you use wrong tariff classifications, if you've undervalued your imported goods, you had wrong countries of origin, for example, you can be assessed penalties by the government, and they are pretty significant. The first thing they look at is what we call the degree of culpability, whether it was fraud, gross negligence, or negligence. And then the second thing they look at is whether or not did the violation result in a loss of revenue to the federal government. Even in cases when there is no revenue loss, you can still be assessed a penalty. So it's really crucial that you understand what the rules of the road are, so you're not getting yourself into trouble with these government agencies.
Thank you, Dan. Then Pendergrass, do you want to add some of your experiences?
Again, echoing what Dan said, finding partners that you can rely on is crucial. I remember a story from freight forwarder that I retired from, where one of our VPs happened to be sitting on the plane next to somebody they learned was a customer. And this client was saying to him, well, the reason we use you isn't because you necessarily have the best pricing or because, you have more bells and whistles. But the reason we use you is because when something goes wrong and I pick up the phone, there's somebody there that's going to help me. And so picking the right partner and getting the correct customs broker who really knows their stuff and is going to be responsive will make your job so much easier, because things will go wrong. Things will get delayed. Things will get damaged. Things will get lost. That's going to happen. But then having the partner that's going to be proactive in looking into solutions will help you sleep at night.
That's a wonderful.
Just add to that, is another thing to consider is a lot of these freight forwarders and customs brokers, they range in various sizes. There's large multinational, multi-billion-dollar a year global logistics firms that offer everything under one umbrella. There's also small regional players as well who are quite competent and quite good at what they do. There are companies that specialize in just certain modes of transport or even specific types of goods. For example, I know there's a customs broker in South San Francisco that only handles imported produce coming into the United States. So if you have a unique product, or maybe your product's coming from a unique part of the world, it may behoove you to try to find companies that specialize in that region, or maybe has some experience around that type of good that you're looking to import.
Agreed.
Thank you, Dan. And Dan, do you want to add something before we come to the conclusion? All right, we have a question section, of course. This was wonderful. I feel very good prepared for my client when we have the next meeting. And the conclusion is today, so we covered a lot of elements, and I hope our audience learned a lot. We could just open the door a little bit to the world of global trade, especially in this case, importing. So we talked about tariff classification and duty rates, country of origin, free trade agreements, a very important topic to see with whom we have, with which countries we have free trade agreements, registrations, some government requirements, product testing. What are Incoterms? This chart was very helpful. And the payment terms, of course, how do you get paid and how do you pay somebody? This can be also cover another round. We can do every point we have here, have another webinar and go more in the details. And how do you select a good partner? Very important. It's with everything in life. So I would say thank you so much for all the covering, and Kimberly is taking over the next slide.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Thank you, Dan Pendergrass and Dan Swartz. That was really informative. I know something about importing. I've done it in my career, and I learned so much from this conversation. So thank you very much. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see everybody and jump to the Q&A portion. First question, is a free trade agreement the same as a preferential trade agreement? And I'll invite you to jump in if you know the answer.
So there, in the United States, we have free trade agreements, like I mentioned earlier, the US, Mexico, Canada free trade agreement. And then we also have what we call special trade programs. These are programs that are not bilateral. We're basically offering a lower tariff barrier for certain countries. And probably the largest one is what we call GSP, or the Generalized System of Preferences, where we allow for the importation of goods from lesser developed countries at a lower rate of duty. GSP is currently expired, but there is hope that this Congress, before the end of the year, renews it. But there historically been countries like India and Brazil, of course, your African countries, the Caribbean. There's a variety of different countries that we provide this preferential trade status that we designate as lesser developed countries.
Thanks, Dan Swartz, and thanks, Pavan, for the question. The next question is from Aaron. Aaron, welcome. I'm glad you were able to make the webinar. Aaron says, I import textiles and textile goods from India to the US, and some of my hotel customers are in Mexico, and they indicate that it's very difficult and expensive for them to import from the US to Mexico as there are high tariffs. Does Mexico not reciprocate the free trade with the US, or do my Mexican customers have high tariffs to pay due to the country of origin not being the US and being India or / not declared?
Yeah, Aaron's right on the point. So the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement covers goods that are of the origin of the members of the agreement. So it has to be a US, Mexico, or Canada origin product in order to receive those preferential tariff treatment for import.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Susan Spitz. Hi, Susan. I have heard that Incoterms determine who holds the risk, but it doesn't determine ownership. Is this correct? Can you address this?
Yeah, risk transfer and ownership transfer do vary, and it depends on the designation in the Incoterms that you're using.
Yeah, I'll just add that for ownership, it's not addressed with the Incoterm. You have to address ownership through the terms and conditions of the sale through your purchase order T&Cs or through a separate contract. You want to specifically have a provision that addresses the transfer of title from the seller to the buyer and when that's going to occur.
Great, thanks to you both. Next question is from Pavan again, and he says, or she says, excuse me, what is the recourse in case of mismatch in the HS code mentioned by the foreign seller and the HS code adopted by the local customs authority in the country of import? Sounds like a great question.
Yeah, the issue is that the harmonized tariff coding and description system is an international system that's adopted by 240 member countries of the World Trade Organization. But it's only harmonized internationally at the first 6 digits. We're actually one of the few countries that require a full 10-digit number. Most other industrialized nations use an 8-digit number. So you can have a supplier providing you a tariff classification that does not match up with what we have here in the United States. And that happens quite a bit. There rarely is variances between customs authorities at the first 4 to 6 digit number of the tariff. It does happen, but it is rare.
Thank you very much. Next question's from Emery. If I buy products with CIF, Incoterms, do I still need to get cargo insurance?
Well, the CIF means that you are including the insurance as part of the Incoterms. So that either is purchased from your freight forwarder, ocean provider, or independently, as Dan was mentioning earlier, with your business insurance, a writer there, or a company that specializes in that.
Yeah, the CIF term, it'll dictate that the seller is obligated under that term to obtain the insurance for that cargo. So that's their responsibility, the seller. I would ensure if you are buying product on a CIF term that there's an actual underlying policy for the cargo. I've seen circumstances where companies have bought CIF, something's happened to the product, you go back to the supplier and they say, whoopsie, we never got insurance on it. But you paid a premium, a higher value for the product because it was supposed to be insured.
So if you import using CIF Incoterms, you would ask for a copy of the insurance policy.
I would, as a matter of practice, yes.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Aaron again. He's running into a challenge at the moment. He's undergoing a blind shipment from his supplier in India to his customer's customer in Japan. He did not obtain an Indian country of origin, as he usually does so, but he believed he could obtain one in the US through the local Chamber of Commerce by providing the other elements of documentation, the invoice, the packing slip, and the bill of lading. The Chamber of Commerce in Chico, California was not willing. What's your advice for this shipment and your advice for the future?
Yeah, Aaron, I actually sent an email to Kimberly earlier this morning on this issue. She brought it to my attention. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is my understanding, they're not going to certify product that is not being produced here in the United States. That's what they're doing when they're issuing certificates of origin. They have a way of validating the existence of the business entity here. So in your instance, I understand you don't want the customer in Japan to know who the supplier is in India, and that's not unusual. So you got a few options. One is that you can structure the transaction so that either the supplier in India is acting as the importer of record going into Japan, or alternatively, you can either potentially act as a non-resident importer in Japan if it's permissible. A lot of customs authorities don't allow it. If they don't, you'll need to find an agent. And if you find a customs broker, they should be able to find somebody for you, and the broker themselves may even be willing to act as the importer of record and shield that information from your customer in Japan as to who the seller is in India. Or alternatively, there is a free trade agreement between India and Japan. I imagine that's what the interest is in getting hold of the certificate of origin to lower that rate of duty on import into Japan. Alternatively, is you just look at eating that tariff as a cost of doing business from shielding your client from that supplier if it's that important. But yeah, I'd say you have to look at either structuring the transaction, I think, a little bit differently from an Incoterm perspective, or looking at another party to act as the importer of record in Japan.
Dan, thank you very much. And Aaron, I'll forward the email information that Dan sent me as well. I'll send that on to you. Susan has another question. She said, can you talk about de minimis? How is it determined? The retail price or the landed cost or something else? Who has a familiarity with de minimis?
You want me to jump in on this?
Yeah.
Okay. I imagine de minimis kind of plays into two different ways. One is in the meaning of like a free trade agreement. There's de minimis with that, but I think what she's talking about, and I might be wrong, is that there is a value threshold for imports into the United States. If they are less than $900, I believe it is now, they can be entered into the United States without having to make a formal customs entry or having to deposit any duties on those goods. And this is really a big issue for U.S. Customs that I think is going to undergo some significant changes over the next year. But yes, there are companies that are able to ship goods, particularly out of China and elsewhere in Asia, into the United States as small consignments, less than $900, and you're not having to make a customs entry. The value for that threshold, that $900, is going to be the transaction value, the amount of money that you're paying or remitting to the foreign supplier for those goods that you're buying.
Thank you, Dan. And Kevin pointed out that it's $800.
Thank you.
So yeah. Last question, and which is perfect timing. Anonymous attendee noticed that on the chart for Incoterms, the seller's obligation and the transfer of risk were located at different points. He or she would love to know why this is and what's the difference between the seller's obligation and the transfer of risk.
Well, as you negotiate with your supplier, part of the negotiation is not only the price of the goods, but at what point in the transportation process will the risk change from your supplier to you, and who will be responsible for paying which portion of the transportation pie. So that's why there's different designations as it moves through the process.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much to our panelists, Sylvia, Dan Pendergrass, and Dan Schwartz. I'm going to quickly share some last information with you about programs that we have to support your business growth. And I wanted to let you know that our grant from the NorCal SBDC supports no-cost support for importing, exporting, cross-border, and U.S. e-commerce. We have a program that you can apply for to get support from people like Sylvia and Dan, as well as the other many and very talented counselors that Kevin mentioned. And I will put that information in the chat in a second. That's this JOT form that says to complete. You can also contact me directly, and I will also put my email address in the chat. And then finally, I'll mention two things. First is that we plan to have a small cohort. We're going to make it available to have an importing workshop, a series of workshops to a small cohort of people. The details are yet to be determined. The timing is to be determined, but as you complete the form, the JOT form that's shown here, please indicate if you're interested in perhaps participating in the series of importing workshops. Finally, you'll receive a follow-up email from me There'll be a survey link in there. We ask you to complete the survey. There'll be an importing checklist that kind of covers all of these elements we've discussed and then provides resources so you can do some of your own research. We'll give you this PowerPoint presentation and as well as a copy of the recording. And then with that, I would just say, I would thank you very much. I will put in the chat the information about the how to either reach me